Well, thanks everybody for joining this session. If you can't tell by my accent, I'm from Australia, so please don't hold that too much against me. A little bit tired from all the jet lag, but appreciate the opportunity to speak here about the MMM evaluation and open governance framework that we have been building at Mutinex. I want to talk a little bit about who the hell this Mutinex business is before I kind of get into it. We're a market mix modeling platform. We work with the likes of Domino's, Churro, a number of other brands globally. We are probably the largest vendor across the Australian market, and more recently have been expanding very rapidly in the US market. One of the things and central propositions we focus on is growth answers on demand. And one of the central problems that we see in the MMM sector is there's not a lot of trust in many of the outputs. So hands up here who's run a market mix model. Anyone? A few people? Hands up here who's seen a pretty bullshit outcome from the market mix models at some stage. Seeing lots of hands despite these very bright lights. This is a really common problem. In no other sector where you are having billions and billions of dollars decided by models is there such a distinct lack of governance. And that's leading to a trust crisis in MMM. The trust crisis is primarily coming from black box models, leading CFOs uneasy. How do I know these ROI figures are even real? We've often heard these sorts of comments from people kind of trying to assess the models, and particularly the tension between marketing and finance teams. And of course, with the open source frameworks, this is getting worse. The open source frameworks have not necessarily delivered an explosion of high quality MMM, they've also delivered an explosion of pretty mediocre MMM. Private algorithms and third-party vendors can't be open source. Why? We don't have a lovely big ads business subsidizing giving away our code for free. So it's very hard to debug and stress test those models with any uniformity. Regulatory scrutiny is rising. The SEC recently referenced predictive analytics models, increasingly a desire to stress test transparent, repeatable benchmarking from forecasting models and to have clear mechanisms to explain why and how results are reliable. As MMMs move from backward-looking to forward-looking, as we just saw from that great presentation from analytics partners, increasingly this will shift to be a requirement for MMM models as well. And of course, budget risks. The wrong MMM or a badly specified and low-quality MMM can cost organizations hundreds of millions of dollars. So, why does open source governance matter? Well, full visibility, every line of code in a governance stack should be public, version controlled, peer reviewable by everybody in the industry. We believe that there should be community scrutiny. Bugs, biases, edge cases get caught faster, and if there is one transparent, reproducible standard for the market mix modeling sector, bad models and bad actors will get caught faster. Audit trails. We believe that there should be CI logs, change logs, and test histories that prove exactly how numbers were reproduced and validated. And of course, compliance by design. Apache 2.0 licensing means that no vendor should own and commercialize a governance framework in our view. And I think this is a critically important aspect of this. For too long, every vendor has slight variations on how we do governance. And that is the central problem of why MMM governance is poor and why MMM governance is not well adopted across the industry. Now, in Mutinex's view, we want clear, reproducible standards across our industry. And I'll note, a lot of these standards, I've heard many third-party vendors already doing a version of this. So a lot of my conversations with third-party vendors, and in the Australian market, we were lucky to have quite vocal support from the likes of analytic partners, from the likes of other vendors active in the space, for this framework. Internally in our business, we created a dedicated special interest group across data science, marketing science. Our marketing science teams are mostly staffed with ex-finance types, ex-analyst types, and also people across data input, across the data input phase, to look at how do we create reproducible standards for model inputs, outputs, and tests. The framework that we started with today starts with testing coverage. Why did we start there? We think it's the part that people are frankly getting wrong the most and where we see the most damage being done. What we looked for is transparency and benchmarking. So we implemented this framework specifically in the Mutinex environment across all of our pipelines. We transparently share every test pass rate and fail with the thresholds to every single client or every time the models are updated without fail automatically. And we've also built in comparisons to the open source models by default. Why is the comparison to open source models so important? Well, because most of the time, you can't understand a benchmark unless you've got comparisons. And our view is that, frankly, the model layer of the MMM sector is rapidly becoming commoditized. And so what we're trying to do is actually establish very clear apples-to-apples comparisons so that people can assess very, very clearly. We believe that one industry standard is what we need to believe in and what we need to deliver if we are to have an industry that's sustainable with the explosion of MMM models. Let me flip this to a worst case outcome for everybody if we don't have consistent governance in the MMM sector. If we lack consistent governance in the MMM sector, we'll have huge variability in the results. And we saw before how many people have seen crap outputs from MMMs. And what that's going to mean is trust in the industry and category is going to degrade. You often see this with explosions in new technology. Look at how much mistrust is starting to build up around LLM outputs being reliable. The same thing could happen to MMM as it becomes a more ubiquitous tool if we do not act to create clear standards to govern them and to govern whether or not they are reliable for large financial decision making. So, what does our model benchmarking suite handle today? And it's worth noting, our model benchmarking suite is open source, but I don't think any of the tests that we're going to show you today are particularly revolutionary or inventive. And I know that's probably ridiculous saying that as the person presenting it. What that makes me question is, in open source models, is it a design choice not to have these validation tests built in to the actual platforms? Because I actually think that these tests are not rocket science. We looked at cross-framework head-to-heads. We've got PyMC Marketing versus Google Meridian versus the in-house models. One of the things that we focused very hard on was a framework that would work across Bayesian and frequentist models to begin to implement Robin as well. Why did we do that? We want to try to give apples-to-apples ROI comparisons and perturbation comparisons. One of the things notable is when I say ROI confidence, I'm not talking about confidence intervals there as well, just to be very clear. We also built an easy adoption for all vendors to use. So the CLI is very easy for other vendors to use by design and deliberately, including ourselves to integrate model artifacts quickly for head-to-head comparisons. And of course, it's very easy to run it over time. It's deliberately designed to keep running, to keep comparing, to keep evaluating the metrics, and to detect drift. Why is that last point absolutely critical in MMM models? Funnily enough, MMM models are not static entities. Often we have different variables that may be missing that these metrics can detect when quality is degrading. I'll give an amazing example of this that was publicly spoken about. Asahi, one of the largest beer brewing companies, obviously alcohol was affected fairly significantly during COVID. We were able to detect very early on the rapid kind of impact of COVID by using some of these out-of-sample governance tests to actually see that the model was really going wacky at predicting anything more than a month forward. And so we were able to say to them very clearly, actually, we should not be making any financial decisions off the market mix model right now. The insights are not reliable. And that's the type of conversation that if you have good governance, you can actually start to enable that conversation. We heard a lot in the previous presentation about trust. I believe that the conversation should be trust but verify. And I think that is the critical importance to actually elevating trust from a consulting-led approach, which is not standardized across an industry, to an approach where we can quite clearly reproduce it, assess it, and deal with it objectively. Why do we think this is going to have an amazing real-world impact? And then I'll actually start to talk about the metrics themselves. Well, firstly, CFO confidence. Every finance department wants to audit things. Governance frameworks means that they can go through line by line, and even if they're not getting the IP code of the model itself, they can at least have a very clear standard to reproduce and understand it. In our mind, this has been one of the single most powerful tools for building credibility and trust with finance. The second is due diligence. I can't tell you the amount of times I've been in an RFP pitching for MMM, and the conversation about methodology has been, explain your methodology to us and have a conversation with data science. Now, for a complex topic that's allocating millions and millions of financial decisions every single year, that is not good enough. And so what we need to do is start to elevate and have better MMM evaluation and pitch processes, particularly as it comes to methodology. That will mean pitches, RFPs, and model evaluation should at least become about objective benchmarks. How well you understand a business should have an objective impact on the ability of your models to forecast financially and accurately. And that's one of the critical things about scenario planning. You shouldn't be scenario planning off tools that aren't able to predict well. And of course, risk reduction. If you're constantly benchmarking these sorts of areas, you can actually start to tell when a financial model, when an MMM model should not be used to make financial decisions. And we think that's really, really critical within this sector. So the 4 tests we've built, and then we'll show you a quick video on the suite. And again, I want to emphasize, these are not rocket science. These are very basic tests. They don't cover some of the more complex tests that we would run, like endogeneity checks and multicollinearity checks. Firstly, out of sample. If we hold back, say, a month, 3 months, a year, how well will the model be able to predict sales with just the inputs that it's given? And that's a good indicator of whether or not you can use that model for predictive checks. Retraining stability. If we add a small amount of data to this model, so say I add another month of data, do I see the results radically change that indicate that the model is not finding a reliable insight? Perturbation. If I add $100 here and there across the time series, do I see the ROIs radically change? I've seen that one a whole heap. And false features. If I fake a media channel and throw it in there, am I starting to see random attribution to that channel for no good reason, particularly if it's a very, very messy feature? And again, that's indicative of a really bad model if that's happening. So just to show you very quickly, and then I'll kind of talk through how we're taking contributions and kind of where the next steps are. I've got one of our senior data scientists.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam McCormick, Senior Data Scientist at Mutinex. Today I'll be walking you through how to use Mutinex's open source MMM validation library, specifically an example with Google's Meridian. So the general workflow involves loading marketing data, configuring your model, connecting up to our library, and then you'll be off to the races, ready to run the test suite and get concrete results. We make it extremely easy to connect up to our library. Simply pass in the MMM object that you've configured. Our software will automatically extract the relevant configuration information, enabling us to run the tests and evaluate your model with no additional fuss. The tests themselves can be split into 2 broad categories. The first is accuracy, which simply means how well does your MMM predict the sales target. Now, the primary purpose of an MMM is to isolate the effect of media. So if you can't predict sales in the first place, this is a major red flag, and it's probably not an MMM you want to be using. We evaluate this on both an in-sample and an out-of-sample basis. The other category of tests is stability. Specifically, this means if you change your input slightly, say by adding more data or revising your historical spends, does the story that the model's telling in terms of the media coefficients change drastically? If so, this is a sign of a brittle model and probably not one you want to be trusting. I hope that was helpful. We currently support Google's Meridian as well as PyMC Labs, PyMC Marketing, MMM, and we're looking forward to adding support for other open source frameworks very soon.
Thanks, Sam. So, how people can get started with this. So firstly, it's an Apache license. Anybody can clone and configure this. We have a bunch of thresholds defined in the package, very clearly out of the box. You can invite stakeholders to kind of view it. CFO, finance, data have all been shown this across organizations that we've seen to verify and validate MMM models. We personally have plugged this into CI/CD to give automatic benchmarks as we update our core model R&D as well, to start to give us a really good sense of the impact of any kind of central model update in the R&D space against our overall model. And of course, we are trying to build a community around this. Our primary objective is to work with as wide a range of people as possible to generate the first open governance standard to evaluate MMM models and build the category forward into a reliable, trusted asset for marketers to make large-scale financial decisions against at scale. And I think that is the most important thing as an industry we need to be doing in measurement if we're going to shift at scale from deterministic to probabilistic models. What now? So, firstly, Mutinex is committed to building open standards for governance. We are going to transfer every single test we possibly do into an open source framework over time. And we are going to also focus on enhancing the trust layer for third-party vendors and actually commit resources to continue to build an open framework that other vendors can adopt. In particular, we're looking at how vendors can provide API endpoints to do this. We're going to just do that work because we think that's important to the category. We want to enhance the ability for all vendors to work with the framework, particularly third-party vendors who are unable to share and open source their code because they cannot give away their MMM code for free without that nice big ads business, to actually start to enhance all vendors' ability to generate trust. If you want to explore our governance framework, you can look at it straight on GitHub. There is a white paper that our marketing team wants you to download on the thing. I'm an engineer personally, so I'll just send you to the GitHub link. You can partner with us to compare current models head-to-head with ours against a benchmark. That's something we very often do, particularly in the open source space. And one of the things that we're particularly excited about is we are building a large-scale piece of analysis on the performance of open source models. One of the reasons we haven't just run that immediately is we believe that a fair comparison needs to have the same level of feature engineering to actually make sure that it's an apples-to-apples comparison. We have too many data scientists, PhDs, and purists in our business to cheat, unfortunately. And if you want to contact me and talk about any of the work that we're doing to deliver growth answers on demand, or to look at the governance framework, talk about it in more detail, talk about how to collaborate and build this standard, we'd love to hear from you because we believe this is such an important issue in the industry. If we are to deliver on the promise of MMM and probabilistic models to model businesses and be relied upon at scale to make large-scale financial decisions, we have to build the governance frameworks that support it and support finance teams trusting us at scale. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Henry. I think what you're doing to standardize MMM is spot on. You know, I have some experience in the credit scoring industry, and when I started, it was the Wild West, and we actually standardized it, and it was for regulatory agencies.
That was actually where we stole it from. Sorry.
Yes, so it's very effective, and eventually the regulatory agencies, they adopted credit scoring. They viewed it as a fair way to assess lending. But you're trying to also convince finance organizations. So have you worked with some finance organizations in terms of socializing this with them to see if they're going to eventually buy into it?
Not as of yet. You know, we've we focused on building the code,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Yeah.
And that's probably where my comfort lies,
Yeah.
mostly with the team on the product side. Normally my erstwhile co-founder, Matt Ferrugia, who's in the audience, is the one we put on stage, but I'm here with my Hawaiian shirts today.
Yeah.
But I think that, long term, this shouldn't be held by one vendor. I just
Right.
strongly believe that. Like, I don't
agree.
think that it is good for a vendor to own this, and that's why we've done it under the Apache license. I think why did we then just go and build it ourselves? I think pretty simple answer. We'd approached some groups about doing it. They were too slow. We see the explosion of open source MMMs and the very rapid incentive programs being rolled out to drive the adoption of those amongst certain groups. And we felt very strongly that the MMM industry in 18 months without strong governance is going to experience a serious trust problem. And we're very confident in open sourcing this because we are very confident in the robustness and long-term forecast of our model. We obsess over this.
Right.
So I think from our perspective, we know how important this is. We've also, very early in my career, I've admittedly stuffed this up once. So, so I've also made the mistake and paid the price on the other side of not having good governance. And so I think that is very, very important that long-term this becomes a standard that is not owned by a vendor.
Great. So let's take some questions from the audience. I'll take one that came in through the chat. What would the role of governance model play in giving feedback to vendors? Is the goal to provide guidance on where and how to adjust code? Doesn't that then remove a competitive edge?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things at play here. One is a governance model can provide feedback to both the client and the vendor as to how appropriate that model is for large-scale financial decisions. And I think that's very, very important here. I think that, the goal to provide guidance on where and how to adjust code, that's true, but also the goal is to make the models more accurate and more reliable long term. And I think all vendors should be wanting to optimize to that to some degree. Why do we rely on aeroplanes being so safe? Because they have very good standards about how they do it. Does that mean that certain planes don't have an edge over others? No. There are lots of other things I believe involving MMM, service, features, partnership, collaboration, ease of product use, all of those sorts of things, which also provide competitive edges. I also think that third-party vendors don't have to share their benchmarks publicly or how they achieve those benchmarks publicly. They can work privately with clients on them as long as there's a shared framework of governance that is well understood and transparent. Then clients can choose whether or not they want to move off that standard. The problem, I think, is that there is no standard at the moment.
Right.
So, and unless we have a baseline to work off, you can't iterate one way or the other.
What about data? Do you think that's another competitive edge that different firms may have, different types of data?
Yes.
Okay. In an effort to build community, does Mutinex have approved or verified partners and MMMs?
No, and the reason we don't have that at all is because we don't believe we should be playing a role in making a judgment on that. We are an MMM vendor, we're conflicted. So I just don't think that it's a viable pathway to do that. I don't think it's the sensible thing to do to try to drive wider scale adoption in this. Great.
How does a company like Mutinex come into play? If I have an MMM partner I'd like to work with, but they don't have access to their modeling data?
Well, so one, I think the open source framework is deliberately designed to be very easy to use by an internal data science team. What I will say is that, and I'll say this quite cheekily, if the Australians can use it, the Americans certainly can. You're all much brighter and cleverer than us.
I don't know about that.
So I think that, I think that from my perspective, that's why I think that it should be adoptable across the US market. I think in particular, we often would just say, if you're running an RFP process, you should have this in there. You should absolutely be benchmarking your models. You should absolutely be insisting vendors do a bake-off. And if they can't, you should be asking why not. Because we really do believe that's a critical challenge in how MMMs are being evaluated today. I don't think that methodology pitches should be won on charisma. I think they should be won on facts. And I don't think many RFPs do that well today.
Great. What were the major obstacles that you ran into when you were conducting these tests, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I think so. A major challenge with any governance project done well at scale, and that we've experienced over the past 3 to 4 years of running these tests privately, is that we had to get very good at talking to clients about when these tests go red, which happens, with some degree of frequency across a very large client base. I mean, we cover a huge volume of clients across a huge volume of categories, and they're all major enterprises who know how to interrogate this stuff, who are relying on us for millions, if not billions, of dollars of decision making. And so I think that, learning how to equip our teams to have good conversations about this. I'll give you an example. I've seen holdout accuracies go quite bad, but they're often because of a missing data point. So let's just say we've gone through an economic shock, or a competitor's done something radical in an otherwise stable kind of market. That's when you can see things like holdouts decline. And that's when you can see things that just that the model cannot predict well. And so I think having these tests in place actually unlocked us to try to have some of those conversations. But of course, having an organization that has a culture of having hard conversations with clients is not an easy thing to build.
Right.
And so I think that's been a very important aspect to it. I think from a technical perspective, one of the things that we also faced coming into this and in designing the framework is we are a Bayesian shop by default. Controversially, I don't think frequentist models are that useful for market mix modeling, but I accept that they exist. One of the kind of pain points that kind of flows through off the back of that is designing a framework that is agnostic of the frequentist versus Bayesian debate to some degree, because Bayesians will like to look at, if I'm in the Bayesian model, I would look at priors versus posteriors as well and check all of those things. That's very hard to do within, if you want to compare a frequentist framework. But the only way that we can actually adopt this at scale is to make sure that we're covering both sides of the debate. I would encourage anyone on frequentist models to change to Bayesian models to make your life better. But yeah, so I think that's been a big technical challenge for us to overcome.
And the Bayesian models, you view those as being more transparent, being able to explain them better? I
think they have more explainability.
Yeah.
I think as well, like marketing tends to operate on a distribution. We don't know what ground truth is. So I think when you're looking at an industry that has no ground truth, a distribution is more appropriate than a point estimate, just by kind of virtue of logical thinking.
Right, and be able to update afterward the
correct.
And other
And things like Bayesian updating unlock a lot of speed. So yeah.
Great. Well, that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause, Henry.